So my name is Christine Krieger, and welcome to CSL in Session, supporting students with invisible disabilities in the classroom. If you have not had the chance to attend a CSL in Session before, there's going to be some opportunity for you to engage with us as we go through. We try not to do a lot of sit and get. We want you to be able to engage with the content, so feel free to use the chat area to send us questions, and I will keep a lookout for that. We also have a poll for you to take today and a couple other questions that I believe Liz will be asking as we go through. We are providing captions, live captions for today that should be showing up in this, in our stream text. So you can, if you need captions, you can let us know about that. And let's see, make sure I'm not missing anything. We are also recording today's session, and the recording will be available probably by tomorrow morning on the Libraries Learn website. And at the end of the webinar, I have a link to that. So make sure I haven't missed anything here. So without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our presenter for today. Elizabeth Novosel has been a librarian at the University of Colorado Boulder for the past 6 years and works with a variety of departments, including computer science, mathematics, economics, information science, and German. And so, Elizabeth, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, welcome everyone. Let's see. We're kind of the wrong spot here. Sorry. Okay. I don't know why it was in the wrong position, but yeah, welcome everyone and thank you for coming. Today's session, I have a lot to talk about and I'll try to get through all my slides, but sometimes I'm a little bit overly enthusiastic about what I can cover in a session. I did want to let you all know that if you have any questions or comments, to please put them into the chat at any time, and I'm happy to engage with you through that medium. So we're going to talk about a few different topics today. I want to start with discussing what invisible disabilities are and how they impact students in educational settings. And then I'll finish today's session with a little talk about how to create inclusion and support for invisibly disabled students in instructional spaces. I think it's important to say that I have developed this to use in all of my practices in the university environment. But I think the information I'm going to talk about is really useful for all different sorts of instructional spaces. It's also important to me to talk a little bit about my own positionality and who I am and what I bring to this talk. So I am a white, female, heterosexual, cisgender, middle-aged, and highly educated person. Very average for a lot of librarians. I have some invisible disabilities, but they're really well managed through excellent and affordable healthcare, which not all people have access to. So I really do pass as non-disabled. But I do have children who have invisible disabilities who are more significantly impacted. So I also bring the perspective of a parent to my understanding of these topics. I'm not an expert. This is not my area of study. I'm not a professor in any sort of education or psychology. I am a professor in library science, but I just like to make sure everyone knows that. So I'm just really passionate about supporting disabled students and researchers, and I'm still learning. So people here may know more than I do in some ways. So please feel free to share. I'm also very open to talking about things after the fact. So I encourage people to reach out. So I wanted to start with a discussion among all of us, actually, about what is a disability and how do we know if someone is disabled? And to do this, I wanted to have a brief activity which could look like a lot of different things. We could have, we have a pretty small group today, but we could open up a room to talk about it. We could have individual reflection, we could work in partners, we could just use the chat. So it's sort of whatever everyone prefers. But we'll have 3 questions. Does anyone here have a preference for how we go about this? Would you be most comfortable participating through the chat, or we have some breakout rooms set up? Chat is a good idea. Okay, great. Well, let's see. Chat works for you too. Wonderful. Okay, so here are the questions. And you don't have to respond to all of them if you don't want to. But when you hear the terms disabled person or person with disabilities, what images come to mind for you? The next question, so you can respond to that one. You can think about it while we talk about the other ones as well. But do you have any significant experiences that relate to when you learned about disabilities? Like for some people, that's a childhood experience. Yes, people are saying that they have a diverse image of this. Um, and if so, if you did have some kind of formative experiences, how did they impact you? So I can share that when I was a child, and I'm older, I was born in 1974, so I'm 49 years old. When I was a kid, I was taught that I should not point at anyone, I shouldn't ask questions, that it was rude, that it's, leave people alone. So for me, the stereotype that comes to mind, when you say disabled, is wheelchairs or crutches or physical disabilities. You have a person in a wheelchair. So Annie, one of the participants, is also saying that, but it's a cloud of thoughts that are founded in your lived experience. That's right. Much older. Anyway, so I don't have a memory of my own formative experiences, but I just wonder sometimes about my children's, because I may have, made them feel like it's a shameful thing to ask about. But for a lot of people, I've found when I talk about it, that they feel like they can't ask questions, and it's a topic that we get shut down about. And so I think that impacts on how disabilities are handled in classrooms and learning spaces, because we feel like we can't talk about them, that we will hurt someone, and that we will make mistakes, which we probably will, right? And I will probably make a ton of mistakes here today. For the recording, I wanted to share some of the things people are saying on the chat. So the elementary school, someone says, my elementary school had separate special education classes and all students with cerebral palsy were at my school. My image of disability is based on that. The only contact we had was at lunch and recess. I also remember being asked not to stare or say anything as a child. So yeah, there was a lot of different messaging depending on when and where you were a child, and people in different countries have different experiences. And feel free to continue sharing if you'd like on these questions. Oh, so another participant says, I have personal and family experiences with disability, and I also worked at a disability rights organization before becoming a librarian. So this person probably had a really different take on this. Yes, intending to be polite, but actually stigmatizing. So there's lots of issues around communication with disabilities. Yes, our participant can do our next webinar. That would be great. So, in a larger group, and we can do this here too with this small group today, but like, what's it like to talk about this topic? For me, it can be very, even though I actually try to talk about it as much as I can. I've presented a few different places because one of my personal goals is to inform my colleagues about disabilities as much as I can, as much as I am able. But it can be very stressful to me because I'm afraid I will hurt someone. Like a lot of those things from my childhood still are with me. Yes, I'm always learning, says one of the participants. And absolutely, that's me too. Okay, so I wanted to take a minute before we get into a little bit more of the real content here, is to talk about language. So with any DEI topic, there's always language issues, right? Well, not more than DEI, like many, many things. People's identities have lots of variations of how they want to refer to themselves. Um, so I wanted to just ask you all here to share again in the chat what you think might be better. So the option number one is person first language. So person with a disability, or number two would be identity first language. So a disabled person, for example, or an autistic person. Um, these are the two like kind of dominant ways that people refer to disabled folks. Um, yeah, one of the participants is saying that they feel the discussion of this in society has shifted from number one, so person first language, to number two. And I have another person says they have person first language embedded in their brain now. And someone else prefers number one since we are so complex. And it's really interesting is when you start to look at different professional organizations that, for example, advertising, et cetera, you'll see a lot of different sites talking about person first language. So person with a disability or, a student with a disability, that kind of language, from that perspective, emphasizes the humanity of the person and their personness rather than the fact that they have something that could be construed as a less than situation. But number two, the identity first language, so the folks that really like this way of referring to disabled folks, and that you'll notice I use this one a lot, tend to see their disability as a major part of their identity and that it's really important to them. And they don't want to, it's kind of a claiming of it, right? And I might be saying that wrong, but it's not trying to diminish it or say that it's something wrong with them. They're saying, for example, the autistic community feels very strongly about autistic person to say, I am autistic, rather than to say a person with autism or a person with autism spectrum disorder or that kind of thing. Deaf community as well. So the deaf community feels very strongly. I work with someone, a research partner, because we do some work on disability in libraries. We have actually a study just starting now. I just got IRB approval. It's very exciting. But she identifies as autistic, and so she prefers disabled person. So I tend to use that language. But what's very important for any of this is to hear what other people are saying. So if you're talking to someone who has a disability or identifies as disabled, whatever language they're using to mirror that, because that's their choice and their preference. So, and I think most of us are very sensitive to that fact, but just to kind of state the obvious, because there is a lot of disagreement on this. And there might be other options too. They might not want either one of those. So yes, the unsatisfying answer to this is it depends. It depends on preference and situation and group, etc. And it will probably continue to change. So another term, a group of terms you'll see within the literature, at least the academic literature, is a lot of debate on whether invisible, hidden, or non-apparent disability is the correct term. Again, looking to what someone prefers. Most often you're going to hear invisible disability. It's just more commonly used than hidden or non-apparent, but different people have a preference there. So non-apparent can kind of be a little broader, right? So something might not be fully invisible, or they just prefer that. And using the word invisible to refer to someone who has a non-dominant identity can be a little bit controversial or unpleasant. So it can be just something to be aware of. And I guess that's my main message with language, is just to be aware and to kind of keep an eye out for the variability out there, and to listen for it. Because if we pay attention and we know what some of the issues are there, then we can be sensitive to people's preference. Okay, so let's talk about a few definitions. Like, what is disability? What is an invisible disability? So according to the ADA, and this is kind of an unsatisfying definition, but it's often cited, so I thought it was important to say, and many, many things are based on it. But a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So that's a pretty basic definition. They don't have, the ADA doesn't have an invisible disability definition per se, but the Invisible Disabilities Association does, and theirs is a little more thorough. So they say an invisible disability is a physical, mental, or neurological condition that is not visible from the outside, yet can limit or challenge a person's movements, senses, or activities. Unfortunately, the very fact that these symptoms are invisible can lead to misunderstandings, false perceptions, and judgments. And really, this definition encompasses the main reason why I like to talk about this topic. Because people who have disabilities are not always parent, and they face a lot of very challenging things in educational settings. So I wanted to ask you all, and I think that the group we have here today is pretty knowledgeable, but what are some examples of invisible disabilities that you know of? If you just want to throw a few in the chat. Yep, autism spectrum disorder is one. ADHD, yep. Mental illness, health-related conditions, vestibular disorders. Oh yeah, vestibular disorders, epilepsy. Yep, these are all great. So I came up with a list, and so here's my list. This is just a few examples. Yep, mental illnesses is in the chat. They're very broad, right? So everything from learning and developmental disorders to psychological, psychiatric, mental health stuff going on for people, medical conditions, head injuries, so many things. Deafness is also considered an invisible disability by many. Others consider it a non-apparent disability. So there's kind of some wiggle room here, but all of these kinds of conditions can really impair or put barriers up for people in terms of participating in society and in education specifically. So why is this topic important? And I think I've already touched on this, and I think you all probably have some pretty good ideas of why this is important. But I do like to talk about some of the data that we have. And unfortunately, there isn't a great data source. There is no consensus on the percent of the population, for example, that has invisible disabilities. First of all, aging. People in the chat are adding some more. Aging itself leads to many invisible disabilities. That's so true. Age is considered by some a disability, a medical condition by others, and not at all for others. But so the definition of what an invisible disability is can range. So that in itself limits the data sets you can find, but you'll see anything from 10 or even a little less to 20% of the population is thought to have invisible disabilities of some sort, at least one. And that increases as you increase in age. We all probably know someone or have invisible disabilities ourselves. And my third point on this slide is that many people with invisible disabilities do not identify as being disabled. For example, I have several health conditions and I have ADHD, and I really have a hard time considering myself disabled because I feel like my disabilities are very managed and don't impact me the way others impact themselves. So I just feel like it's uncomfortable to call myself disabled, not really because I find it shameful. Some people do, and some people don't want others to know because of the bias that they can have. But I just don't want anyone to think that I'm trying to, well, I'll get to this. I'm not trying to take advantage of the system, right? That comes up a lot. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. So here's some other just general information about disabilities, but essentially 1 in 4 people in the US have a disability, and 1 in 10 or more are estimated to have an invisible one. So 20% of students in higher education are thought to have a disability. That is not really substantiated by any real hard data because it's based on lots of things that might not be 100% accurate. Only a third, this one point, which I should have highlighted, but a third of students with a disability only a third inform their college if they have an invisible disability. Many disabled people are not able to go to college. There are too many barriers for them. And even if they do, they often do not achieve the same level of professional success. And you see this especially in the STEM field. Again, I would give you data if it was super reliable, but there's just so little data that we can collect or that anyone has collected. Disabled people are higher risk, there we go, for depression, isolation, poverty, violence, all of these things I put on the slide, but health inequities, lack of access to transportation, financial security. So it's just very important that we address this because people are really at higher risk when they have any sort of disability. Um, and I think it's worth just stating over and over just that people who are disabled, whether it's invisible or visible, whatever it is, they have daily struggles to manage their conditions, to get around a world designed for anyone but them, right? They have trouble with accessibility to things. They face microaggressions regularly and prejudice pretty much at every turn. So here is data we do have, and that is from the National Center for Educational Statistics. So in the year 2021-2022, they had 7.3 million students from the 3 to 21 age range that received services under the IDEA Act, so the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So that's 15% of all students in public schools. So approximately 75% of those 7.3 million students have what can be considered invisible disabilities. So what's important to say about this data is that 7.3 million students, that 15% that's been identified that get services, they're the ones that have gotten those services. There are a lot of people, a lot of students who do not for a whole variety of reasons. But that's just sort of something to keep in mind there. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the barriers that invisibly disabled students may encounter. So first of all, as I've mentioned before, and as maybe perhaps pretty obvious, but ableism and stigma. So you might say, well, what is ableism really? So ableism is discrimination that favors those who are not disabled and disfavors or makes difficulties for those who are disabled. So the stigma can range from a wide variety of different ways people can interact with disabled folks in a negative way. So it can be anything from assuming they're inferior, unintelligent, incapable of things, that people assume they could never be romantically involved, especially people with physical disabilities. But those with psychological disabilities or autism, people make a lot of assumptions about their social lives. But also along in there, there's also some stigma that is about trying to make a positive out of it. So either saying, oh, they have autism, but they're going to be really great at math or something like that, or the sciences, which may or may not be true, right? So these kind of generalizations that we make about people. But also stigma can show itself in other ways, like being overly helpful, overly accommodating, rushing to help someone if you think they need it, making a big deal out of it. So that's also another form of ableism and stigma. So inaccessibility in educational settings, that can be anything from spaces to resources to the tools you're using in an activity or for a specific assignment, or so just things aren't working the way they should. And that we'll talk more about that later, all the various forms of inaccessibility. But there are also a lot of social challenges that come along with being disabled. So the whole range of disability has these, but maybe first and foremost, the most important thing to say is that someone who is dealing with any sort of disability has more to manage in their life. They have, if they have some sort of visual issue or dyslexia or something, they're trying to use Audible or voice to text technologies, ebooks that have readers, screen readers, all of these things that may or may not be compatible with the different formats that instructors or librarians or teachers in an elementary school classroom or a presentation on a topic at the school for parents or whatever. They are trying to deal with all of that on top of everything else. That leaves them less space in their life to have time for social interaction, to have time to take care of themselves. Um, on top of that, bias and stigma works their way into the social challenges. And a lot of times people find, especially if they have behavior that is considered out of a very specific range of normal, people may not know how to interact with them. Kind of like our activity at the beginning of this session of what were your early impressions of disability. People get uncomfortable and they might avoid them. So there's a lot of isolation, there's a lot of lack of support, and that takes to the last point here. Lack of support across the board. A lot of people aren't aware. They don't know how to provide the support. They rely on disability services offices or ADA implementing bodies, whatever that would be for, whatever context we're talking about, to take care of disabled people. And they assume that they're taken care of. It's not their responsibility. So generally across the board, students and people with disabilities of all sorts are going to have less mentorship. They're going to have less access to funding. They're going to have less support from their peers, from their teachers, mostly because of a lack of understanding. So I just said it a second ago, but I will reemphasize that educational and other institutions rely heavily on what we call accommodations to provide support for disabled students of all sorts. So accommodations, and we'll talk about what those are exactly, and I'm sure people here have heard of them before, but once you are identified as having a disability, you can apply to have accommodations of various sorts to help you get access to education or different parts of your life. It's important also to note that accommodations generally only address inaccessibility or accessibility issues. They do not help at all, generally, with stigma or social impacts or lack of other kinds of support. Okay, so accommodations are based on what's called the medical model of disability. You may have heard of this before, but the medical model is essentially that disability needs to be diagnosed and cured and accommodated so that the disabled person can function as closely to what we could consider, in quotes, normal as possible. Accommodations are given to help them gain access to resources, so whoever they are, whatever kind of disability they have. Unfortunately, those accommodations are often not quite as successful as everyone would hope. Um, and this system requires disabled people to rely on the disclosure of their disability to get this sort of assistance and support and accommodations. And sometimes that's a disadvantage. It plays into that bias, discrimination, assumptions, all of those things. And in some settings, can be very destructive, or people are at least afraid that it will be destructive. So accommodations are pretty flawed. Here are some of the common ones you'll see, especially in school and in higher education. So extended time on exams and assignments, exams or tests in quiet or alternative spaces. Sometimes that's the same for assignments too, in class assignments. You can get modified assignments or assignment schedules, like have different parts due at different times. Accessibility technologies, so you can have screen readers, etc. Lecture notes or other sorts of notes are provided. Oral or other kinds of exam options or assignment options. Availability of recorded lectures and sound canceling headphones is a big one. There are many others. Those are just a few common ones. So I've already kind of said this, but although accommodations do help many people, and I sometimes feel like it's important to say that accommodations, for all their flaws, really do help people get through and get access to things. But that it's such an imperfect system for so many reasons that it's important for us all to know about other ways and to explore how we can really support disabled people beyond accommodations. Because disability services does not support everyone. So why might people not be supported? I've already said a few of these things, but they may not have a diagnosis. Diagnosis can be very expensive and difficult to get. As a parent of children with invisible disabilities, I will tell you it was very expensive for us to get them diagnosed. We're really privileged that we had money to do it, and two parents who were really invested in doing that. Other people may have diagnosis, but they can't get all their paperwork necessary for disability services. It can be, especially at university level. Educational systems in schools can be really different and also difficult to navigate, but they will also require paperwork. So this process can be too long, too hard, too demanding, either for parents or for disabled people themselves, and a lot of people give up. Some I've heard here at CU, people will get on the wait list to get accommodations, and they can be on the accommodation list for a very long time before their case is even addressed, which is really frustrating to hear. Sometimes accommodations are not approved. The wording in the IDEA Act and through the ADA is that schools have to provide reasonable accommodations, and they don't define what that is. What is a reasonable accommodation? Maybe to someone who's disabled, reasonable is different than the person who's in charge of paying for or figuring out how to provide that accommodation. So a lot of times they're not approved. Another thing we hear a lot about here is that instructors could not or would not provide accommodations. So either they're refused to do so, and that evidently there's not a lot of enforcement there, or they have no way to do it. Like there's a space requirement and they can't change the spaces, or they have no support. They don't know how to. Instructors often have no training, especially at the college level. In elementary schools, they may have some, but some teachers and some librarians will have a lot more than others. Many people don't want to declare their disability, like I said before. They don't want to identify that way, or they don't want to deal with the bias or the stigma, or they find it shameful or embarrassing, or they want to try doing it on their own. There's a whole bunch of reasons why people would not want to declare it. Another thing I hear from especially graduate students here at CU is that they don't know what to ask for. They don't know what's available. Like they may have had accommodations in elementary school and middle school and high school, but you get to the college level and they just don't, it's a different system. They don't know what to ask for. And that might be in many different situations. You don't know what could be provided to you. There's no list. Sometimes disability services or some other supportive ADA enforcing body may try to provide technology, but it's broken or it's not compatible. I already sort of mentioned that. Or it doesn't work. Like a lot of screen readers don't work with equations, for example. They also don't work for chat. So you can get the chat function on many of our systems it will not be captioned. And there's just a lot of other factors that interfere. People have no transportation, weather, spaces, etc. Okay. I did want to ask people to reflect, and I know that I have so much to get through. I'm not going to have a conversation about this, but to think about what kinds of challenges could invisibly disabled students have in your class. It's just something to think about. Probably would be good to put this at the end as well. So here's just a whole bunch more things that people have said that disabled people could experience in their classes. But things about accessibility tools, no technical support if an accessibility tool isn't working. Various materials can be not accessible. Sometimes people put images of text on slides without really realizing it, and that's not screen reader compatible. Sometimes they're expected to read or do some sort of activity quickly in a class, and they can't because they might have slow processing speed. They might not be able to read quickly. Sometimes they aren't able to interact with others or don't want to, or it shuts them down. And so that could be experienced. Cold calling puts a lot of people in a very difficult situation in terms of anxiety and freezing and not being able to function. Presenting is sort of similar. Attendance requirements for people with medical disabilities or physical ones too, even though that's not really what I'm talking about here, but it can be impossible to get places sometimes. So other things are not being able to access asynchronous resources or notes or recordings or handouts after the fact. Because even if they're present, sometimes people with disabilities miss things, or their technology didn't work, or they zoned out for a minute, or they were overwhelmed. So that having asynchronous resources can be very, very helpful. And physical spaces can really impact people, even with invisible disabilities, because we often think of physical spaces as something that impacts the people in wheelchairs and people who have trouble with actual physical movement. But the strong sense and lighting, different kinds of lighting, fluorescent bulbs are usually referred to, but I actually was just reading about how some of the other kinds of bulbs can also have a strobe-like quality to them, including LED lights. And that can be very difficult for some people, gives them headaches, other people can have seizures. So lighting can be really problematic, or uncomfortable temperatures or noises, too much noise, people can't filter it out. So there's like a million things in the physical environment that can be a problem. And inflexible modes of communication. So if someone doesn't want to say something, but they would type it anonymously, that also can prevent them from participating in class. Okay, so that's just like a little mantra of mine. Let's find better ways to support disabled students. So now I'm going to switch to like, what can we do about it? And I also want to say, with all that stuff I just talked about, it can be really overwhelming to try to accommodate everyone. And it's kind of impossible, especially when you're new to it and trying to figure out what can I do to make my spaces more accessible. And it's a learning curve for all of us. And I believe the more we're aware and the more that we read and the more that we talk to people and the more that we're open, we're going to learn more and more and make things better. So that's where I'm coming from. So the social model of disability, which you may have also heard of this term. So there's the medical model that I talked about before, which is like addressing the problems to make someone get access through accommodations and to fix it, diagnose it. The social model sees disability as created by society itself. So society has been based on non-disabled people, all those different kinds of disabilities, right? So like this average, in quotes, person who does not have disabilities of any sort is generally how society is planned and built. So we can change them, right? Because we build them, we can change them. So this perspective sees accessibility as a matter of justice and inclusion. And that's where you find things like implementing elements of the Universal Design for Learning paradigm. So that's probably the most well-known way to make classes and spaces and instruction of all sorts, from little people all the way through adult learners. Use of Universal Design for Learning is talked about a lot. It's developed by CAST, so the Center for Applied Special Technology. So it's based originally, I wonder why this isn't showing my words. Interesting. It doesn't really matter. Universal design was architecture. So this architect, Ronald Mace, was a wheelchair user, and he just was very frustrated, along with a bunch of other people at that time, with physical spaces. So there's a big push to make physical spaces have ramps, to have wheelchair access and other kinds of disability access. So that was then applied by the Center for Applied Special Technology. There were lots of people involved in both of these, but to take that concept of making everything accessible and apply it to education and learning environments and work environments. So this isn't I can't possibly talk about all the things you can do. I would really encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to take an introductory course. There are some online options. I have some at the end. CAST itself offers some, but to learn a little bit about the basic principles of universal design. I did want to say that there's kind of three major categories. They talk about the multiple means of engagement. So that's the why of learning. So to encourage learners to see why is a benefit to them. How does this fit their life? How does this instruction or this class or this experience benefit them in some way? So that can really engage students better. So to show them in a variety of ways how it will benefit them. And then multiple means of representation. So that's what they call like the what of learning. So showing different kinds of media and different ways to represent knowledge or understanding. So to give people a lot of different ways to learn. So for some, various kinds of media might be more accessible. Some like to read, some like lecture format. So as many different opportunities you can give students or learners in whatever environment to engage with the material, the more likely you are to give them something that's accessible and understandable and relatable to them. And then the third category is to provide multiple means of action and expression. So that's pretty much the how of learning, which I understand to be alternative ways to have students engage in the process, either activities or learning projects, assignments, exams, etc., and also to express their ability to understand what's going on. So that could be anything from giving asynchronous options for participating or asking questions or engaging with others, to group work, to different kinds of projects where they can show you that they know what is being taught and why and how. But they may not be able to write it, for example, in a nice, short, succinct paragraph. So that's a really, really, really basic understanding of what UDL is all about. But those different principles have many, many different ways that you can adapt them for your own teaching. So my other points from here on are a lot of UDL concepts, but things that really get pointed out often by disabled people or in the literature that I've read about or folks I've talked to. It's really important to limit your content. So when you're doing any sort of instruction, and sometimes, especially in university environments, this is difficult, but students can get really overwhelmed if they're not situated in learning and don't understand like where you're starting from, or if you're trying to cram too many things into one short session. But to be realistic about what you can cover. Academic librarians are terrible about this. It's like we're trying to make people into librarians in 50 minutes or less, trying to tell them all the things to be aware of and to learn about and how to be expert researchers. And learning doesn't work that way. But to communicate, so be realistic about what you can cover, communicate clearly about your content and trajectory. They've found, and CAST talks about this in UDL, giving people an idea of what the content is going to be and where they are along the line of learning. So that trajectory for the day can be very helpful to have people kind of feel less overwhelmed. Like, okay, I'm in the middle now. We're getting towards the end, or we're just at the beginning. And it helps them create mental maps and understand how it all fits together. So focusing on the skills that are the most relevant to the session goals are also really important. It can be easy to get sidetracked by all the things that you want to tell people about, but to really focus on the most important ones. And to find ways to check for comprehension. Don't assume that because people aren't asking questions that they understand. So making sure your learners are giving you some signs. Make activities where you can observe that, oh, they're doing it, they're getting it. So to check in whatever way is appropriate, in many different ways, probably. So making your content and your space and your activities as inclusive and accessible as possible is, one of the very basic ideas of any sort of accessibility. But UDL really emphasizes this as well. Students, as we know, do not all engage or learn in the same way. So sometimes people need options, and it's, at least in my educational past, like there's usually one way they want you to be at the lecture, right? But now, post pandemic especially, we have lots more options for all sorts of programming. But if you are doing physical things, to make people have physical access to spaces, and this is beyond just can they get through the door? Does the little handicapped button work so that the door opens for them if they do have a physical issue? Are the lights appropriate? Is it quiet enough for them to hear? Are there really loud noises or really strong smells? Or where are the light switches? All those sorts of things impact someone's access to a physical space and their sense of safety there. Provide options for the learning and communicating knowledge and participating. I just talked about with UDL. The more options you can give people, the better, the more accessible. One thing that, I mean, I've talked about this a lot, but I think it can be hard for people who aren't disabled or don't have any sort of invisible disabilities to understand what can make people shut down or what can make people feel excluded, especially if they don't share those challenges. That's where I think self-education and listening and having good communication with classes and your community can be really important. And to talk to other people who do research on this, but to know what sorts of things make students shut down. For my kiddos, for example, a lot of cold calling or having to do something quickly will make them shut down because they can't do it. And I've seen that in library classrooms. But other things, like some students are not going to want to engage. Some students aren't going to want to get up and move. Maybe not even those that have a physical disability. Maybe someone's got a medical condition where it's difficult for them to get up and do partner work. Cold calling. So cold calling is when you just call on someone in the classroom. So like if you're asking everyone a question and then you're like, you in the front row, what's the answer? That can be really, really scary, anxiety inducing for people. Others, there is some evidence that cold calling, unfortunately, I looked into this because I was really curious, can be beneficial for some people, but it shuts a lot down. And I really personally think it's a terrible idea. Another thing I've seen people do is that they'll give an asynchronous option. So they'll put a Padlet or something up, and then they'll call on the person that put something in the Padlet. They'll be like, oh, who made this suggestion? You want to tell us about it? And that's like the absolute opposite of what that was there for. So anyway, just to kind of keep those sorts of things in mind. I talked a little bit about this already, physical spaces, just to keep in mind that it's not just about wheelchair access or crutch access. It can be a lot of different things. Also crowding and anxiety. So especially post-COVID, a lot of people do not want to they don't want to feel like they're in a really tight space. Even if they know that the bulk of the pandemic is kind of over, there is an anxiety to being close to too many people. So just to be aware of these things and to observe folks and see what you can do to make it better. Sometimes there's no options, but the more we're aware, the more we can kind of mitigate those things. And also like stairs and elevators and those things, sometimes elevators don't always work or they are slow. And to give grace to people who are late, because sometimes it's beyond their control. So along with the cold calling, and I just wanted to take a minute to talk about active learning. So along with that idea, and I've already mentioned these ideas a few places today, but active learning gets a lot of like attention. It's so great, it gets people involved and like really engaging in the topic, and it does, but not everyone. So to keep in mind that you won't know necessarily if people are disabled. Maybe someone will tell you, maybe if you're in a higher education or an elementary school or middle school or high school environment, you'll be told if someone has a diagnosed disability. You often are not going to know. So just to be aware of the group settings, like making people interact, making them do a task quickly in class, to read something, like, will their screen reader work? Will they be able to read it and process it and do the thing you want them to do? Or will they feel like they aren't good enough or that they're less than the other people in the class? Just to be aware of these things. Again, I'm not saying you can't do them, but just to know that it might be helpful to give options to people where they don't have to do these things, because they may not want to perform publicly. Um, they might not want to catch a ball and answer a question or have to throw a ball to another student or something like that. Um, there's such a range of active learning activities and games and stuff that can be really fun, and they are really great, but they can also really exclude people. One of my colleagues actually was saying that she has a medical condition and can't move her hands in certain ways. And sometimes she's been getting a master's degree. And in the master's class, they had to do some activity where they had to move their hands in a certain way, and she couldn't participate. And she does not identify as disabled, but she kind of felt like that pressure, that not fitting in, not being good enough. It was just an interesting thing. Um, and really, I put on the bottom here anxiety. So anytime someone's worried about these things, they're worrying about the active learning. They're not learning the thing you're trying to teach them, is what it comes down to. These are just sort of, some considerations of different things you can do to kind of mitigate this, and just to think carefully. That's the big message here, is to think carefully about any sort of activity you have and to make it okay if someone's not doing it. Digital resources. So I am no expert, and I know we're getting low on time here. Um, But accessibility issues for digital resources is a really big thing that I urge everyone to learn more about and to constantly update your knowledge, kind of like terms and language change over time. Tools and the internet and technology changes constantly. And in fact, probably in the future, we'll be talking about how, artificial intelligence impacts disabled folks. There's already a whole bunch out there about how it can both help and hurt. Um, but videos are often not accessible to visually impaired students. A lot of times links, internet links and equations aren't accessible to screen readers. PDFs are notoriously difficult to make accessible. I don't know how to do it. I really should. I need to know. I need to investigate that, but it can be really difficult to make a PDF accessible to a screen reader. Flashing screens and lights. So to be aware, if you're showing a video, that a lot of quick movement, even if it's not truly a flashing like strobe effect, really fast little animation things can also be hard for people. Charts and graphs can be inaccessible. Pictures of text, I already mentioned that one. Like if you put an image of like a stop sign that says stop, you can put an alt text in your slides or whatever of what it is, but the screen reader cannot read that image. Social media is often inaccessible as well. So sometimes people are urged to look at that for an activity or part of a class. And those are often inaccessible, all of those platforms. I think they're working on it, but many of them are not accessible. And columns, so different formats can be really difficult. So to look into those things and think about them for your materials. Yeah, I have a whole bunch of other things, but like color as a navigational tool is really difficult and problematic because some people cannot see color the same way. Images should always have alt text. Functionality should be accessible through mouse and keyboard. I guess you can tag it too to be worked with voice control systems, which is something that I've just been reading about lately that I didn't really know how to do. I still need to learn about it. But providing transcripts for any sort of media you have will allow a student to get access to that material. And videos, let's see, what did I say about that? Oh yeah, the audio information always to have captioning, and providing everything in an asynchronous format is going to help people return to it. And this also helps second language learners and a whole variety of people and every student, honestly, to be able to go back and look at your materials. So I'm going to kind of go quickly over these last few slides, but to take your time and to don't rush. Again, that kind of goes with the not putting too much in any given session. Less is more. Having they're lost or not understanding it. And questions sometimes come a little bit later than you think. The agenda, I sort of talked about that already, having a trajectory. This helps clarify your goals, and then students can see how things are going to fit together in your activity session, instruction session. Oh, someone's leaving. Thank you for coming. And it helps people understand the relevance. So the main thing from here out I want to say is just to keep learning. So there's so much to learn about, and it can be really hard. And implementing any of these things, like universal design for learning, it takes time and experimenting and collaboration. So I just encourage everyone to find colleagues and groups that you can learn with, because it does take time and it takes dedication to it, unfortunately. And to have empathy. Our biggest thing that we can do, because disability services might not be able to help someone, they might not be diagnosed, we may not have planned things for them, but the more we can be empathetic with people and listen to them and try to help them figure out getting access to whatever you're doing or presenting or teaching is the way that we can help. So, and then I talk a little bit about bias. But we are really out of time. It is important just to mention that people with disabilities are really high risk for mental health issues. And so the more we all know about providing people, not ourselves, but like how to hook them up with mental health support and to be aware that that could be an issue, the better our outcomes are going to be in all of our different institutions. So I talked a little bit about that on one of the slides, but I do have a few slides and everyone can see these later. But about digital accessibility resources, there are just a few, there are tons out there, and also for universal design for learning resources. And that is everything I had for today. And I wanted to thank you all for coming. And if you have any questions or you'd like to get in touch, please, here's my email. I would love to hear from you. And yeah, thank you so much.
Wanted to thank Elizabeth very much for providing all of this great information. As I said a couple times, we did record the session, and I will hopefully have that posted by tomorrow morning on the Libraries Learn website. You can see Libraries Learn in the chat there. I do have a quick survey for people to take today, and I'm going to post that in the chat as well. And then if anybody needs a certificate for today's session, I'm going to type my email address in the chat as well. Making sure that that is correct. So you can send me an email and I'm happy to send you a certificate. But once again, I really want to thank everybody for participating today, especially at the beginning when we were having some really good discussion. And thank Liz again for providing so much great information during